This is Michael Garino, and I'm going to give you a quick tutorial of how to set up an introductory Kubernetes DevOps environment using Plural. So what we're going to do is set up continuous deployment to Kubernetes with Argo CD, kubectl for cost visualization. It's a very good open source product to do that, and then Grafana for some basic observability. And that's kind of the three basic things that you would need to get started with to use Kubernetes in a production use case, in our opinion. So the first thing you want to do is just go to the Cloud Shell tab in the top left corner of the sidebar in app.plural.sh, and you'll be presented with our onboarding experience. The first step of that is just to set up a personalized onboarding session. It's just a Calendly link, which will allow you to create a 30-minute session with me to go over any issues or troubleshooting you might have with the process. You can also ask me any questions about Plural or about the open source products you might want to be using with Plural in that session. But if you're feeling confident, you can just get started and go from there. You have from there the option to either use your own cloud environment or try a 6-hour GCP demo. The 6-hour demo is a pretty good way to just get a feel for what Plural can do. It's entirely on us. We'll create it on the fly, then deprovision it after the 6-hour time span elapses, and you can effectively test the full functionality of Plural at zero cost. But we know what we're doing, and so we're just going to go straight to using our own cloud, and then you have the option to use the Cloud Shell or the CLI. And the pros cons of the two is just basically ease of use versus security. The CLI will not require you to give us any access or cloud credentials into our own system. So if you wanted to keep complete control of the infrastructure you're creating, that's meant for you. Whereas the Cloud Shell is a completely browser-based on-the-Rails experience. To get your environment set up, you won't have to install a CLI, you won't have to configure gCloud or AWS CLI or anything like that. And just because we want to keep this demo short, we're going to do the Cloud Shell installation. From there, we just need to create a Git repository, which we'll do via OAuth, and then give it a quick name, and then it'll ask you to select the cloud you want to deploy to. We're just going to use GCP for ease of use, and we'll need to create a GCP service account. So I'm just going to find one real quick, and then give us a name for the cluster, bucket prefix. The bucket prefix is just a mechanism to duplicate bucket names, which, if you're familiar, S3 and GCS both have globally unique bucket names, so it's entirely possible for you to choose something that's a bit too generic and actually collides with an existing S3 or GCS bucket. And then we're just going to do a subdomain to register all the web facing front ends DNS entries under. Then once that's all done, it's going to actually spin up the Cloud Shell's pod. That should be a relatively quick process. Takes about 30 seconds typically. Great. Now this is our Cloud Shell experience, and it has the ability to choose the various applications you'd want to install. So we're going to choose Argo CD, like I said, kubectl as well, and then finally we were going to deploy Grafana, which you can see is actually a dependency of kubectl, so it has been selected from it. But then all we need to do is click continue, and we can fill out the basics of the onboarding wizard. So we typically are going to trust the defaults that are here. One thing that might be worth noting is this enable OIDC. So Plural has the capability of acting as an authentication provider for all the apps that you deploy with Plural, and OIDC is that mechanism. It will show you as you log into a lot of the front ends for these applications, but it's definitely a worthwhile thing to enable. It just makes login security completely turnkey. Then, yep, all this stuff looks fine. Looks good here as well. And then finally, if I can type it correctly. Now we're going to click install, and it's going to run the Plural build command first. That's just going to generate the entire Git repo that we want to use to store the state. That's a lot of Terraform code that's going to be generated alongside a lot of Helm code as well to provision resources in Kubernetes. That's relatively snappy, and now it's actually to do the plural deploy. The plural deploy is a little bit slower. It's gonna, especially the bootstrap page of the topological order of deployment is the slowest. It actually has the responsibility of creating the Kubernetes cluster, and we're completely beholden to the cloud's own provisioning time on that, which for GCP is probably going to be in the order of 10 to 15 minutes. Awesome. So you can see that the plural deploy command is actually finished, and it's pushed all the changes upstream. And there's a few things that have already happened in the administration UI of the Cloud Shell that you could probably see are meaningful changes. The first is there are these launch buttons next to all the applications with web front ends, which are just a sort of a convenience so you can know how to get to all of them, and in case you forgot the URLs you typed in. There's also this readiness indicator beside a few of the applications. Basically, Kubernetes is an eventually consistent system. It'll take a bit of time for it to actually provision the resources that you specified with the YAML manifests in all the Helm charts that we synced into your repo. So like it'll take some time to provision maybe the pods for the underlying service, maybe a network might be lagging a little bit, or in this case also the certificate for the load balancer is taking a bit of time for it to provision. If you want to get a little bit more detail on what's exactly going on, you could actually run the plural watch command, which will give you a bit more of a detailed health check of that application. And you can see actually this is probably just a case of the health check lagging. This happens pretty frequently. In about a minute or so, it'll probably detect that all these pods are in fact running. And if you were to run the kubectl scribe command, you could see what's going on with the SSL cert as well. And that is also provisioned. We can do the same for Argo CD, which is a fairly complicated system, so it might take a bit of time for it to converge. But you can see, again, there's a lot of actually running pods. If we were to run kubectl get pods, we could probably see all of them in one view, and it does look like most of them are in fact running. So my guess is this is actually basically ready to go, and we could probably start looking at a lot of these applications. Another thing that might be worth mentioning is there's plural info command for some of the applications with a bit more installation instructions. Grafana is actually a good example where if you wanted to provision admin credentials for one of your Plural logins, you would actually need a login first with the root admin creds and modify it. But let's start looking at some of the applications. And first, we could go straight to the Plural console and see what it offers. We'll just accept cookies and then go right in. It's going to ask us to consent to logging in with Plural. That's the standard OIDC flow I had mentioned earlier. And you can see all the applications are listed in your console instance in your cluster. You can actually use the console to do a lot of basic management of those applications. So we'll provide runbooks for scaling that application. There are components to dive in deeper to the Kubernetes definitions of all the various parts of the topology of the application. So in this case, there's this Argo CD notifications controller, application controller, repo server. You can also look at logs for the application. This is aggregated across all the various different pods that are running it. And if you were to dive into an individual pod, for instance, this one, and the application set controller, you can actually see just its pod logs as well. Since we integrated kubectl, you'll actually begin to see cost analysis for the application too. It's going to be a little bit artificially low. That's mostly just because kubectl is still like gathering the data for the application since it was newly provisioned. And for those applications that use OIDC, Argo CD is one of them. You can bind users and groups to the application. And occasionally there are needs to customize. That's also available here in the console. And then let's get into the various different applications that we've deployed in the stack. So kubectl is the first in the list. It also has an OpenID Connect login experience. And you can use it to really see the details of exactly what parts of your Kubernetes cluster are costing you money. So it's split out by namespace. If you had a few microservices, they probably would likely be deployed in separate namespaces, and that's a good way to segregate the data to understand what's exactly popping up. And It's just a very powerful tool in general to sort of give you a at a glance view of um, what's going to be costing you money in Kubernetes and how to potentially remediate it. Um, there's also Grafana, so we can log in with Plural again with that. And we'll preload a lot of dashboards for you for a lot of different applications. But it's worth mentioning that not only is this a working Grafana instance, but there actually are various data sources for Grafana that you can see. So I'm gonna go to the admin user that was provisioned, so we can see the full details of everything, and I can show you how to make your other user admin as well. So I just need to go into the user that was created with the OIDC login, and then make him an admin, which is good. So if we were to explore all the metrics, you can see we have an instance of Loki and Prometheus. Loki is a log database. It's actually what the console is using to see the logs for all the applications. And Prometheus is a metrics database. Both of those are available, and we'll begin scraping any of the logs or metrics that any workload in that cluster is emitting. So you don't have to think about provisioning all those yourself. Plural is going to basically do that for you as part of a setup of the monitoring stack for your Plural cluster. And then finally, there's Argo CD. Argo CD is a GitOps-based continuous deployment solution that was built out of Intuit, actually. It's a pretty powerful tool, but it'll be able to deploy directly to this cluster by default. All you would need to do is create a Git repository and point it at some Kubernetes YAML manifest somewhere in a subfolder of that repository, and it will start syncing them for you. We don't have, off the top of my head, a good example of those, but there's tons of documentation on how to actually set up your first repo and start syncing with Argo CD. So I definitely recommend you check those out and potentially leverage it. So another thing that I think is worth mentioning with this setup that you could theoretically do is you could also adopt a typology where this is effectively a management cluster for a set of workload clusters that actually run your production infrastructure. So Argo CD has the capability to also perform CD for clusters that are external to the one it's deployed onto. You could have, for instance, a prod cluster and a dev cluster that Argo CD instance is syncing to. You can also deploy Grafana Mimir and Grafana Loki in distributed mode with Plural that are meant to handle scale out and handle very large clusters that are emitting a lot of metrics. And those will auto configure into your Grafana instance. You can also, if you're thinking about like a Plural management cluster and then internal workload cluster sort of topology, maybe a Vault instance deployed by Plural as well would be something you would consider, and then have those workloads actually query Vault to collect any secrets they might need to configure themselves. But I think both setups where the Plural cluster is actually running your actual microservices, or just running the various backend DevOps services, and the microservices have their own dedicated cluster, have their justified pros and cons. The pro of like a single cluster solution would be just like less Kubernetes overhead. The cons would be just like less separation and potential reliability in terms of like keeping the Plural workloads in their own sphere, and then your production user-facing workloads in their own. But yeah, so like this is how we deploy any of the non-Plural stuff internally at Plural, and we think it is actually a fairly complete set. But if there's anything that people have seen that might be useful as well, there's things like external secrets operator that might be of use for some people. You could think about security scanning services like the Trivia operator or Kubescape as well. Give us a shout, and we can either onboard them into the catalog if they're not already there, or potentially show how to use those as well. But yeah, this has been Michael. I hope you guys have a good day.